Now, from African Stream, the Pan-Africanist, William Sakwa, joins us because Africa is beginning to dominate this show. So William is the man to help us through it. William, welcome to the mother of all talk shows. It's the second time, I think, that we've met, so I'm very glad that you came back for more. Scott Ritter and our poll overwhelmingly believe that there's going to be war in Niger. Do you share that view?
Unfortunately not, and thankfully so. Because I think for now, cooler heads have prevailed in Ecowas, where sometime last week they were saying, if you do not reinstate Bazoum in 1 week, we will consider sending a military force into Niger. But then you see, after Niger got support from its people, I think that's the most important thing. The support Niger has gotten from its local population. You have the people saying, if you'd like to get to the presidential palace, ECOWAS will have to go through us. So the local population, one, supports the coup that has just taken place. And two, you have Mali and Burkina Faso who have said, if ECOWAS makes an incursion into Niger, we'll consider it a declaration of war on us as well. So, when you have these factors coming into play, and then adding in extra factors like Mali has Russian military advisors. So this will no longer be an, ECOWAS-Niger war. It will now turn out to be yet another proxy war between NATO and Africa. And it's also important to realize that the organization or the group that's instigating for war to take place in Niger is the West. Like, you can hear them using terms like, we support everything ECOWAS, suggests, and you have ECOWAS, alongside the threat of military force, have enforced sanctions, have cut off electricity to Niger. But coming back to your point, I don't think war will take place in Niger strictly because the people support the coup that has taken place, and neighbors Mali and Burkina Faso have declared their support as well.
Now, Victoria Newland went there to threaten the new authorities in Niger. She told them that overthrowing your elected president by force is simply not acceptable, although she was one of the prime organizers of exactly that in Ukraine. There's over 1,000 American soldiers there based in Niger, and the French soldiers who've begun to leave have not all left the country. If not ECOWAS, what about the possibility of a direct French aggression?
I'll start off by Victoria Nuland coming to Africa in the name of democracy. You cannot overthrow an elected leader and walk away scot-free. And you've mentioned very well, in 2014, that's exactly what the West did in Ukraine. And coming back to Africa, coups have taken place. France has deposed 22 African leaders since the 60s. And this is not just something that happened and passed. France has never taken accountability for it. France has never done reparations for it. If anything, the installation of puppet leaders is what enables the plundering of Africa. But, under this fake guise of democracy, you can fool many people into thinking the government has the support of the people. And now, coming back to the possibility of a French direct intervention in Niger, my understanding usually is, just like the Americans won't send their own soldiers to go fight in Ukraine, in a proxy war, they'd rather someone else do the dirty work for them. And this is exactly what ECOWAS was being set up for. But as you can see, you have politicians from northern Nigeria saying, right across the border, those people are our brothers. You have the Hausa community living both in Nigeria and Niger. You have people from these communities, within the ranks of Nigeria's military. And again, this is what ECOWAS was set up to do. The West got ECOWAS into fighting a war for it. Only that this time, even if they managed to walk over the Niger's military, as they say, comparing Nigeria's military capacity to Niger's, they'll still have a painful insurgency to deal with. And we all know, even in France's case, pure technological superiority doesn't guarantee success. The US was in Afghanistan for 20 years, but, replaced the Taliban with the Taliban. So yeah, despite having an overwhelming military capability over the Taliban.
I've been looking quite a bit more deeply than I had before into this new president of Nigeria who can't accept the affront to democracy that the coup in Niger, according to him, represents. But he doesn't have the greatest democratic credentials himself. First of all, there's very serious and credible allegations of electoral corruption in his own election, and it's still actually before the courts. The opposition have never accepted his election. Secondly, the Senate of Nigeria has refused his demand that Nigerian troops be sent as part of an Ecowas invasion of their neighbor Niger. And then there's his own checkered history. To my absolute astonishment, forgive my ignorance, I had no idea that this man was a bagman for the mafia and the drug dealers in Chicago, Illinois, which doesn't seem like a great qualification to be the leader of Nigeria. These people who are now talking about democracy in Niger, many of them don't have a leg to stand on, do they?
No, they do not. No, they do not. Look at Ivory Coast, for example. You have Ouattara, going against the constitution and running for another third term. What's that if not an institutional coup? But, he's a friend of France. Look at Cameroon, Paul Biya being in power for 43 years, but still, a friend to the democratic-loving West. Now, Tinubu himself, the general perception on the ground is that he's the perfect tool, if you wanted someone compromised to push through whatever policies you'd like. Look at, in a few weeks since coming into power, he has scrapped fuel subsidies. You now have Nigeria, which, has been having fuel shortages despite being the biggest oil producing country in Africa. Now, then again, looking at his credentials back in Chicago, money laundering for his relatives in the heroin trade. If you're, as the American intelligence community has historically done, if you're looking for someone you can dangle a knife over should they step out of line, Tinubu probably still has material interest in the West. He still has, like very many other, Western favorites in Africa, he still has assets in the West. This could very easily be seized if he's seen as stepping out of line. And once you look at it that way, you begin to understand why Ecowas was initially taking the kind of measures it was against Niger. It was merely serving someone else's interests. Because consider what the Americans have in Niger, for example. The biggest drone base in Africa, built at $100 million and costs $30 million annually to run. The US also says since 2012, they've spent $500 million in Niger. So for them, this is not a small investment. And again, just going forward into explaining why this coup is popular. Niger is the second poorest country in the world. And America's response to all this poverty is spending $500 million on militarizing the region. And, if as a young man, you've grown seeing, uranium being dug up from the ground and being sent away to power France, meanwhile, 80% of your countrymen don't have access to electricity, you're going to feel resentment. And at some point, you're going to question, what role does democracy play into, how basically the basic living conditions of people improve. And if democracy is not working, you have people now considering the military option, such as military coups. Yeah.
Lastly, widening the focus a little bit, all these countries, including Chad, complain that the NATO destruction of Libya and its deployment, for they clearly deployed in my own country, openly deployed Islamist fanatics to overthrow the government of Gaddafi in Libya, and the Islamization of Libya in the destruction of the system that they had there before, has now destabilized the whole of the Sahel. And as I pointed out earlier, somewhat to my surprise, as someone who didn't even know there were Muslims in Mozambique, there's an Islamist fanatic insurgency as far south as Mozambique. Isn't this the kind of Frankenstein monster phenomenon? We use these Islamist fanatics to destroy Gaddafi in Libya, and now they're on the march throughout Africa.
Exactly. And again, look at what happened in Afghanistan. The Taliban was initially armed to dislodge the Soviet from Afghanistan. And the end result was, they came back and occupied Afghanistan and reversed back, gains such as women's rights. And going back to Libya, it's exactly the invasion of Libya that has led to the problems we see in the Sahel. Burkina Faso today does not control 40% of its territory. Imagine the economic opportunities missed as a result of not accessing 40% of your country, which is run by terrorists. You have these terrorists also running mines in Mali as well. And if you can remember, last year, an official from Mali said, "Give me an audience with the Security Council. I have evidence that France is supporting terrorists in Mali." So, and again, you get to ask yourself, why doesn't the West also see the negative consequences of invasion, particularly Europe? Because for the Americans, you can say they have an entire ocean dividing them from migrants. But for Europe, if Niger falls, the resulting migrant situation is going to be worse than anything we've seen so far. And again, as we saw yesterday, a delegation from Mali and Burkina Faso were present in Niamey, Niger. And they had this as the main message. We saw what happened in Libya. If it happens in Niger, who knows how long it will take to get things back to normal? 30, 40, 50 years? Basically, they say, we've said no, whatever it takes, we'll make sure that does not happen here. And yeah, I think we should definitely call out the West, because this all benefits nobody but the West. For everyone else, it's a loss, especially for Africans who seem to be finally, finalizing the war of decolonization.